all right. Henry swore by Rapa, and Tehei staked all on Bora Bora for his own blood's sake, while Wada and Nakata sang the sanitary paean of Japan. One evening, as the Snark worked around the southern end of the island of Ugi looking for a reputed anchorage, a Church of England missionary, a Mr. Drew, bound in his whaleboat for the coast of San Cristobal, came alongside and stopped for dinner. Martin, his legs swathed in Red Cross bandages till they looked like a mummy's, turned the conversation upon yaws. Yes, said Mr. Drew, they were quite common in the Solomons. All white men caught them. And have you had them? Martin demanded, in the soul of him quite shocked that a Church of England missionary could possess so vulgar an affliction. Mr. Drew nodded his head and added that not only had he had them, but at that moment he was doctoring several. "What do you use on them?" Martin asked like a flash. My heart almost stood still, waiting the answer. By that answer my professional medical prestige stood or fell. Martin, I could see, was quite sure it was going to fall. And then the answer. Oh, blessed answer. "Corrosive sublimate," said Mr. Drew. Martin gave in handsomely, I'll admit, and I'm confident that at that moment, if I had asked permission to pull one of his teeth, he would not have denied me. All white men in the Solomons catch yaws, and every cut or abrasion practically means another yaw. Every man I met had had them, and 9 out of 10 had active ones. There was but one exception, a young fellow who had been in the islands 5 months, who had come down with fever 10 days after he arrived, and who had since then been down so often with fever that he had had neither time nor opportunity for yaws. Every one on the Snark except Charmian came down with yaws. Hers was the same egotism that Japan and Kansas had displayed. She ascribed her immunity to the pureness of her blood, and as the days went by she ascribed it more often and more loudly to the pureness of her blood. Privately, I ascribed her immunity to the fact that being a woman, she escaped most of the cuts and abrasions to which we hard-working men were subject in the course of working the Snark around the world. I did not tell her so. You see, I did not wish to bruise her ego with brutal facts. Being an M.D., if only an amateur one, I knew more about the disease than she, and I knew that time was my ally. But alas, I abused my ally when it dealt a charming little yaw on the skin. So quickly did I apply antiseptic treatment that the yaw was cured before she was convinced that she had one. Again, as an M.D., I was without honor on my own vessel, and worse than that, I was charged with having tried to mislead her into the belief that she had had a yaw. The pureness of her blood was more rampant than ever, and I poked my nose into my navigation books and kept quiet. And then came the day. We were cruising along the coast of Malaita at the time. "What's that abaft your ankle bone?" said I. "Nothing," said she. "All right," said I, "but put some corrosive sublimate on it just the same. And some 2 or 3 weeks from now, when it is well and you have a scar that you will carry to your grave, just forget about the purity of your blood and your ancestral history and tell me what you think about yaws anyway." It was as large as a silver dollar, that yaw, and it took all of 3 weeks to heal. There were times when Charmian would not walk because of the hurt of it. And there were times upon times when she explained that abaft the ankle bone was the most painful place to have a yaw. I explained in turn that never having experienced a yaw in that locality, I was driven to conclude the hollow of the instep was the most painful place for yaw culture. We left it to Martin, who disagreed with both of us and proclaimed passionately that the only truly painful place was the shin. No wonder horse racing is so popular. But yaws lose their novelty after a time. At the present moment of writing, I have 5 yaws on my hands and 3 more on my shin. Charmian has 1 on each side of her right instep. Tehei is frantic with his. Martin's latest shin cultures have eclipsed his earlier ones. And Nakata has several score casually eating away at his tissue. But the history of the Snark and the Solomons has been the history of every ship since the early discoverers. From the sailing directions I quote the following. "The crews of vessels remaining any considerable time in the Solomons find wounds and sores liable to change into malignant ulcers. Nor on the question of fevers were the sailing directions any more encouraging, for in them I read, "New arrivals are almost certain sooner or later to suffer from fever. The natives are also subject to it. The number of deaths among the whites in the year 1897 mounted to 9 among a population of 50. Some of these deaths, however, were accidental. Nakata was the first to come down with fever. This occurred at Penduffryn. Wada and Henry followed him. Charmian surrendered next. I managed to escape for a couple of months, but when I was bowled over, Martin sympathetically joined me several days later. Out of the 7 of us, all told, Tahi was the only one who escaped, but his sufferings from nostalgia were worse than fever. Nakata, as usual, followed instructions faithfully, so that by the end of his 3rd attack he could take a 2-hour sweat, consume 30 or 40 grains of quinine, and be weak but all right at the end of 24 hours. Wada and Henry, however, were tougher patients with which to deal. In the first place, Wada got in a bad funk. He was of the firm conviction that his star had set and that the Solomons would receive his bones. He saw that life about him was cheap. At Penduffryn he saw the ravages of dysentery, and unfortunately for him, he saw one victim carried out on a strip of galvanized sheet iron and dumped without coffin or funeral into a hole in the ground. Everybody had fever. Everybody had dysentery. Everybody had everything. Death was common. Here today and gone tomorrow. And Wada forgot all about today and made up his mind that tomorrow had come. He was careless of his ulcers, neglected to sublimate them, and by uncontrolled scratching spread them all over his body. Nor would he follow instructions with fever, and as a result would be down 5 days at a time, when a day would have been sufficient. Henry, who is a strapping giant of a man, was just as bad. He refused point blank to take quinine, on the ground that years before he had had a fever, and that the pills the doctor gave him were of different size and color from the quinine tablets I offered him. So Henry joined Wada. But I fooled the pair of them and dosed them with their own medicine, which was faith cure. They had faith in their funk that they were going to die. I slammed a lot of quinine down their throats and took their temperature. It was the first time that I had used my medicine chest thermometer, and I quickly discovered that it was worthless, that it had been produced for profit and not for service. If I had let on to my 2 patients that the thermometer did not work, there would have been 2 funerals in short order. Their temperature, I swear, was 105 degrees. I solemnly made one and then the other smoke the thermometer, allowed an expression of satisfaction to irradiate my countenance, and joyfully told them that their temperature was 94 degrees. Then I slammed more quinine down their throats, and told them that any sickness or weakness they might experience would be due to the quinine, and left them to get well. And they did get well, Wada in spite of himself. If a man can die through misapprehension, is there any immorality in making him live through misapprehension? Commend me the white race when it comes to grit and surviving. One of our 2 Japanese and both our Tahitians funked and had to be slapped on the back and cheered up and dragged along by main strength toward life. Charmian and Martin took their afflictions cheerfully, made the least of them, and moved with calm certitude along the way of life. When Wada and Henry were convinced that they were going to die, the funeral atmosphere was too much for Tahi, who prayed dolorously and cried for hours at a time. Martin, on the other hand, cursed and got well, and Charmian groaned and made plans for what she was going to do when she got well again. Charmian had been raised a vegetarian and a sanitarian. Her Aunt Netta, who brought her up and who lived in a healthful climate, did not believe in drugs. Neither did Charmian. Besides, drugs disagreed with her. Their effects were worse than the ills they were supposed to alleviate. But she listened to the argument in favor of quinine, accepted it as the lesser evil, and in consequence had shorter, less painful, and less frequent attacks of fever. We encountered a Mr. Caulfield, a missionary whose 2 predecessors had died after less than 6 months' residence in the Solomons. Like them, he had been a firm believer in homeopathy, until after his first fever, whereupon, unlike them, he made a grand slide back to allopathy and quinine, catching fever and carrying on his gospel work.